Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, y'all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought, of course, that I would give my fight review and my fight analysis of the Naoya Inoue versus, I believe, Roman Cardenas fight, which, of course, was hands down the best fight of this weekend. Now, of course, this was supposed to be our quote unquote Super Bowl weekend for us boxing fans or for us boxing aficionados, especially with Canelo Alvarez, Ryan Garcia, Devin Haney, Teofimo Lopez, and Naoya Inoue all being on the same weekend. But, the Ryan Garcia Triple Fury event was terrible. Besides Teofimo Lopez putting up a very good performance, the rest of it, to be quite honest with you, just really did not live up to expectations. I mean, the Devin Haney Jose Ramirez fight, I pretty much expected that to be like what it was, but the Ryan Garcia and Rolly Romero fight was terrible. It is what it is. And then of course the Canelo Williams Skull fight was not much better. But Inoue, of course, was in a very action-packed fight. And of course, what we're usually used to is Naoya Inoue dominating his fights and usually not having that much of a scratch on him. But this fight was a little bit different. And of course, for those of you that ended up watching the fight, Inoue just didn't lose a couple of rounds within this fight. He also got heavily knocked down in round two once again. Of course, the last time that he got knocked down was against that of a Louis Neri because, Inoue, although he is an extraordinary level fighter, sometimes he does have some faults that he needs to sharpen up on. But there's going to be a few things that I'm going to commentate on this video. First, I'm going to kind of break down this fight, what I've seen, and, the future. And then we're going to talk about some comments or, Inoue's pound for pound, status that I think needs to be addressed. And then I'm also going to be talking about Inoue's possible reign at 126 pounds, which of course is kind of going to be the weight division that he's going to be looking at next. But let me also address this. Inoue, after the fight, because I purposely stayed around long enough to see who he was going to call out, and Inoue stated that he specifically is going to be fighting that of the Uzbekistani fighter MJ Akhmadaliev, I believe. So the certain amount of people that have been claiming that Inoue has allegedly been ducking MJ Akhmadaliev now for about a year or two, you're finally getting your wish because Inoue immediately called him out. He called him out specifically and stated that he's going to fight him in September. Now I don't know how you duck a guy that ended up losing to an opponent in Marlon DePaulis, and then Inoue fought that guy for the rest of the titles. But, it is what it is. Apparently, according to these guys, Inoue is ducking that of MJ Akhmadaliev. But Inoue is finally fighting a guy. And listen, I get it to a degree because, he is very talented. But we'll talk about that fight as it goes on a little bit later. But to break down the fight, overall, once again, Inoue, I thought that he started off very good. He actually showed a little bit more head movement, at times than what he usually does. Although Inoue has very good movement, especially with his feet. He has great feet and very quick foot movement, and uses small steps in a pretty good way, and he has a very great stance. Inoue, at times, with his head movement, sometimes he can be a little bit stiff. And even in the first round, he kind of was, getting hit with a little bit too many jabs. But of course, he was starting to get the better of Cardenas, I believe, at the end of round one and also in the middle of round two. But Inoue, once again, you can tell that Inoue is just a guy that he's just a bloodthirsty dude. Inoue is one of those fighters that, he loves beating up people in the ring. He loves overall showing off his technique. He loves, really having a true actual fight, or at least being bloodthirsty in the ring to where he believes that he can beat people up. Inoue is one of those guys. And there are just certain guys that are like that. They're the nicest guys outside the ring, but in the ring, they basically want blood and guts. That's the type of guy that Inoue is. Now, am I stating overall that, he wanted to get knocked down and, or anything like that? Because some people are going to misconstrue that. No, I'm not. But there are certain fighters overall that like to be in a little bit of a war or, get a little bit bored when that other fighter or when they believe that, I've had such a great string of successes that more than likely this fighter up and coming that they're not going to be on my level. And we've seen this with a certain amount of fighters. We've seen this with Tyson Fury, when he was kind of fighting, I believe, that of whatever the hell that one dude's name was from Sweden or whatever the hell his name was, from, I can't remember the dude's name. The guy that bloodied him up right before he fought Deontay Wilder in the rematch. Can't remember the dude's name. But we also seen him with Terrence Bud Crawford against Aegis Kavaliauskas, where he took him very, very lightly, even probably got knocked down in that fight with a good overhand right. And then once he took him seriously, ended up knocking out Aegis Kavaliauskas, the Mean Machine. Inoue is a little bit similar. But Inoue is so, skillful, and on top of that, athletically talented, especially with his power and speed, that oftentimes he can get a little bit too overconfident or get a little bit too arrogant, with some of his striking. And Timothy Bradley, what I will state about this, he gets a bad rap for being a quote unquote, bad commentator. Or if you're a part of the LDBC new media, of course, he gets a bad rap for being a quote unquote, house dude, or, an Uncle Tom, until he says something they agree with, and then they're all on board with him. But I mean, Timothy Bradley actually brings up a lot of good points as a commentator. And Timothy Bradley does bring up some of Inoue's faults, with a very good point. He says Inoue, although he's an exceptionally talented boxer, sometimes he does have a little bit of a problem on the inside. He gets hit a little bit too much there. He has a little bit of a problem on the inside range. And on top of that, Inoue sometimes is known for keeping his hands down or loading up his offense. And all these things, in my personal view, they can be very easily tightened up on. But Inoue is just going to have to be very careful, because when he did get knocked down in the second round, and he did look pretty badly hurt, or at least hurt, somewhat badly after that knockdown, it was the same punch somewhat that Luis Neri ended up landing. And the reason why that ended up landing is because Inoue thought that he was getting the better of him, and he thought that, just like some of the other opponents, that eventually he was just going to fold under the pressure and fold under the power. And eventually that ended up happening as well, but sometimes you got to take a little bit of time with it. And Inoue, I think, at first wanted to kind of put on a flawless performance, but then he just got too bloodthirsty, and then he just got, a little bit too bored. Or I think overall that he ended up kind of wanting, overall to, to get the knockout to impress especially the American people. And you really got to be careful with that. And some people overall will think that I'm making excuses for Inoue. I'm not trying to make excuses for him whatsoever. But sometimes there are certain fighters that they get a little bit too overconfident for their own good. Sometimes they go in looking for the knockout, or thinking that that fighter is just going to bend under the pressure, and then it doesn't happen, and then they end up getting hit with something or knocked down in return that they did not expect. So you got to be very, very careful with that, because this is the second time that this has happened now, I believe, in Inoue's past 3 or 4 fights. He's got to be very, very careful with that, because especially at 126, if he ends up doing that, although I doubt that he's going to do that as much, he could potentially end up getting very badly hurt or knocked down multiple times, or potentially knocked out. He's got to be very, very careful with that. But let me also respond to this comment, because I believe I had a comment in my comment section that stated that, do you still have Inoue pound for pound, after this performance, and, all this sort of stuff. And this guy apparently came on my channel. He said, see, this is why I think you're a racist, because because Inoue had a performance like this and you still have him pound for pound. This is why I believe that you're a quote unquote racist. Do you still believe that he's up there? Blah, blah, blah. Well, one thing I've also stated is this. A certain amount of people overall, they come on my channel and they believe that, that I'm going to be one of these pro-racial channels, or one of these, channels that has a very racialized view. And I'm not one of those guys. And if you've been around my channel long enough, you would know that before the Stephen Fulton fight with Inoue, that I stated that Inoue, in my personal view, was the most overrated fighter on the top 10 pound for pound list. I was one of the guys that personally stated that. And the reason why I stated that is because although I thought Inoue was an exceptional level talent, he didn't have really any clear A-grade level names on his resume. But once again, certain people, they just take a look at the channel and they assume overall that, I abide by certain racial rules or all this sort of stuff. I'm not one of those guys. This is a logical channel where I break things down both off of their positives and negatives, off of their faults and off of their strengths. I'm not a person that once again goes off of that. But, sure, I'll talk about racial things if I need to. But, I'm not one of these guys that is racially motivated. I'm just not. So it is what it is. But that being stated, what I'll also state is this. I've never stated that Inoue was my number 1 pound for pound fighter. The only fighters that I've claimed to be the number 1 pound for pound fighter of the past several years have been Lomachenko when he was on that streak before he lost to Teofimo Lopez. Then after that, Canelo Alvarez right before he lost to Dimitri Bivol. And then after that, of course, Terrence Bud Crawford once he defeated Errol Spence Jr. And now Alexander Usyk now that he defeated Tyson Fury. See, a lot of people, of course, do want to claim that Inoue is the number 1 pound for pound fighter. I understand why a lot of people overall would claim him as the number 1 pound for pound fighter. But just as I stated with Terrence Bud Crawford for a very long time, he basically passes the eye test in a whole lot of ways. Although, of course, there are a couple of, nicks here and there on his record because he gets knocked down, every once in a while, like against Neri and this guy. But, the thing is that we all know that Inoue is an extraordinarily talented fighter. But in order to be, in my view anyway, definitively the number one pound for pound fighter. You have to have either that win that everybody knows about, that is looked at as another top 10 pound for pound win, or you have to have a great enough resume. Canelo, Lomachenko, Crawford, and Usyk, by the time that they had defeated certain opponents, they all had that resume. Right now, although Inoue's resume, I think, is stacking up a little bit better, especially if he beats guys like MJ and some other guys, his resume is definitely getting better. But in order for him to legitly be the number one pound for pound fighter, he's going to have to get certain names on his record, probably like that of a Jesse Bam Bam Rodriguez, and also like that of a Junto Nakatani. But we'll see what ends up happening there. But I wanted to address that first because someone, of course, had commented that, and I wanted to respond to that. Anyways, that being stated, certain people, of course, they are going to run with this and state that, see, we always knew that Inoue was overrated and blah, blah, blah. Well, listen, I mean, this is really nothing new. Fighters, they fight sometimes to the level of their competition. I think it's very obvious that at times Inoue does. We also seen this with Nonito Donaire in the first fight where Donaire, he was probably a little bit older and really had no business being that competitive in the first fight. But because I think that Inoue thought that he was probably going to run him over like what he did a lot of other opponents, he ended up having a very tough fight in that fight, even with a broken orbital eye bone. But then the rematch ended up happening, and what did he do? He knocked him out within 2 rounds. So Inoue is just one of those guys, and a lot of boxers are kind of those guys. They fight to the level of their competition, especially if they believe that, these guys, that they just can't compete with them. And I have no doubt in my mind that Inoue sometimes has those thoughts rattling around in his head. But that being stated, once again, he is going to have to be sharper. There are certain things that Inoue definitely can sharpen up on. He does advertise his offense at times, and when he throws certain shots, either both hands or one hand will be down, and he needs to watch out for that. When he's throwing the lead hand, keep that right hand glued to your face. When it comes down to it, if you're, coming in, don't just have both hands down. That's why he ended up getting knocked down both in the Lewis Neri fight and also in this fight. He got way too overconfident because he started hurting him or landing some good shots, and he thought, overall that he was just going to go in there and that he was going to knock this guy out easy and that this guy was just going to fold under the pressure within a few rounds. And once it showed that he was not going to do that, Inoue did have a little bit of a fight on his hands. But one thing I'll give Inoue credit for is that he knew that there was a little bit of problems on the inside. He also knew that there was criticisms about his fight game on the inside. So he tried to fight this guy on the inside. He showed that he could weather the storm, weather the power, and also come back and knock this guy out, get some good body shots, and eventually stop this guy within 8 rounds. Probably should have been 7, but for whatever reason, the referee was really letting this guy hang on, in that 7th round. But, it is what it is. But Inoue did what he needed to do. His next fight apparently is going to be over MJ Akhmadaliev. We'll see how that fight ends up going. I think that he'll probably beat MJ because although MJ is very talented, I don't think that he has the right type of style to beat that of an Inoue. And I think that Inoue is a better boxer and all around more talented than him. But that will be probably about an A- level win because, MJ Akhmadaliev is looked at as very talented. Although it'll be interesting to see if the people that have been claiming that Inoue has been ducking MJ and all this other stuff, if they'll claim that that's a big win for Inoue, because I guarantee you that more than likely they're not going to. To be quite honest with you, most of the channels or most of the people that don't like Inoue, let's be real, a lot of them are these guys from the LDBC new media channels or that are these pro-black channels that are huge Terrence Bud Crawford fans or Devonta Tank Davis fans or Shakur Stevenson fans because they feel like Terrence Bud Crawford is getting disrespected overall and other black fighters are getting disrespected by certain guys, by Usyk and that of Inoue. Those are pretty much the only main guys that I mainly see criticizing Inoue. Let's just be real about it. It is what it is. And listen, some of the criticisms, I get it. Some of them, are apropos. I don't think that Inoue right now is number 1 pound for pound either. I have both Crawford and Usyk above him, although Crawford, it's getting a little bit more tenuous as to whether or not he really is top 2 pound for pound because he's just nowhere near active enough. He's had only 1 fight really within the past 2 years. And that 1 fight that he did have over that, I believe, of Nizar Madrimov, it was about a 7 rounds to 5 fight over a guy that had 12 total fights. So once again, that's why I criticize his performance. But of course, this fight recently by Inoue definitely deserves its criticisms as well. So we'll see overall what ends up happening next. But right now, Inoue is at number 3, right below Usyk and right below Crawford, because I do not think that his resume quite stacks up with those guys. Definitely not that of an Alexander Usyk's, but I don't think that his resume stacks up with Crawford's either. Because Crawford, at least that win over Madrimov, I would debate that it's A-, and he also has that humongous win over Errol Spence Jr. So Inoue will have to stack up his record a little bit more, but we'll see what ends up happening there. As for the reign at 126, because I wanted to talk about this, Rafael Espinoza also was on the undercard, who of course is one of the more elite champions, debatably the best champion at 126 pounds. Rafael Espinoza is a very decent fighter, but to talk about him is no offense, although he very clearly has great boxing ability and is very talented. But that dude is a weight bully if I've ever seen one. It's no offense. But whenever I see these fighters that are several inches taller than everybody else, in that weight class, they really should not be allowed to fight in that weight class. In my personal view, that should probably be a rule, in certain weight classes, maybe other than the heavyweight division, because that's just a division that can range anywhere from like 6'2" to 6'9". But I mean, when you talk about guys like Sebastian Fundora at 154, that shouldn't be allowed to happen. When you talk about guys like, this dude, Rafael Espinoza, I believe, at 126 pounds, the guy is 6'1", at 126 pounds. Like, it's absolutely ridiculous. And don't get me twisted. He's a very talented fighter. He can make the weight. Great on him. But it's like, it's no offense, but that it's very clear that that guy is way bigger than pretty much everyone else at that weight class. Paul Williams was another example during the welterweight division for a very long time. And then once we seen him at 160, we pretty much seen what happened. But not to get really off track here, but, I told people for a very long time that I'm coming up with the top 10 most overrated fighters of all time list very soon. Part of the reason why I've gotten on Oscar De La Hoya's ass and Tommy Hearns' ass so often is because when you talk about those guys, Oscar De La Hoya was like 6 foot or 5'11", and he was starting off at like 130 to 135. It's like, once again, we don't really see how great you actually are until you start stepping up the weight classes. And once Oscar really started to step up the weight classes, he really didn't win a whole lot of the big fights in his career. And it was kind of the same thing with Tommy Hearns. Tommy Hearns was exceptionally talented, but Tommy Hearns was a guy that could have fit really at the middleweight division. That's why I believe that he even won a fight or won belts, I even believe, at the super middleweight division, because Tommy Hearns was a guy that easily could have fit at the middleweight division. He was like 6'1" with a 78-inch reach. He was like damn near, as tall and lengthy as Muhammad Ali. It was ridiculous. So I mean, it is what it is. But talking about Naoya Inoue for that weight class, it's going to be interesting to see, because I'm not 100% sure if Inoue is 100% sure, for sure, going to be a champion there. And it's not necessarily that I don't think that he has the skills or that he doesn't have, overall the ability, but those guys are going to be a decent amount bigger than him. And if not in terms of height and reach, in terms of girth as well. When you take a look at Nick Ball, there's no doubt in my mind whatsoever that is going to be a very tough battle. And apparently Inoue states that he wants Nick Ball within one of his next fights, which is going to be very interesting. But in my personal view, Inoue may want to take a fight at 126 first, because Nick Ball is one of the tougher styles to face. He's a little bit like that of the Sean Porter style. He comes forward. I don't think that he's quite as skilled as Sean Porter, but he's someone that probably is an A- level fighter. He recently defeated he recently defeated that of a Raymond Ford, who is one of America's more talented fighters, and he ended up beating him in that class, I believe, by a little bit. Nick Ball is nothing to mess around with. He's not someone that is anywhere near as technically sound as Inoue, but he's going to be a decent amount bigger in terms of thickness and in terms of girth. So Inoue's going to have to really watch out in that fight, man. He's going to have to be very, very careful. I'm not 100% sure if Inoue can win that fight, and it's not like Inoue, once again, at times is always flawless defensively. He can be hit, and it's going to be interesting on the inside, because although Inoue is a great boxer, where he is the weakest in my personal view is the inside range. And it's going to be interesting to see if he can keep Nick Ball off of him the whole entire time, or if he can compete with him within that weight class, because I'm not sure if Inoue's level of power is going to be quite the same in that weight class. We'll see. He definitely has A+ level power and A+ level speed, but we'll see what ends up happening there. Inoue's going to have to do a lot of proving there, and that really will determine if Inoue later on can completely, confirm his spot to the clear number one pound-for-pound spot, as well as also possibly beating Junto Nakatani and Jesse Bam Bam Rodriguez. But that's a fight that's going to be very particularly interesting. Nick Ball is going to be probably the introductory fight. It's a very big fight. In my view, it's an A-grade level fight, and I'm not 100% sure if Inoue is going to win that one. In fact, I may even possibly pick Nick Ball in that fight, but I need to see. I need to kind of break that fight down. I think that Inoue obviously is the better boxer of the two, but Nick Ball is going to bring a lot of power. He's going to bring a lot of brass in that fight, and he's going to bring a lot of size. So it's going to be very particularly interesting. Now, sometimes height and reach, of course, can even it out, and they're about at the same height and reach, I believe. But Nick Ball, in terms of girth, he's going to be a lot bigger than him. So we'll see what ends up happening there. But once again, that's pretty much, overall what I thought that I would comment on this. I just thought that I would talk about this fight. Very interesting fight. I thought that Cardenas, of course, he gave the best go that he could. But that also being stated, after the fight, apparently he stated something along the lines of, I knew that he would come back. So what that tells me is that a lot like Caleb Plant in the Canelo fight, where Caleb Plant stated something along the lines of, I'm a pretty good fighter, huh? What that really means is that you never thought that you could beat this guy in the first place. And, these guys like Lewis Neri or some of these other guys, they land one good shot against Inoue or they knock him down, and then Inoue starts out boxing them, and they don't really try to box with Inoue. They pretty much just try to wing it and land that punch over and over and over again. And I've seen the same thing with Lewis Neri. So it's going to be interesting to see Inoue against guys that really can try to box and win possibly within a multitude of ways. Guys like Junto Nakatani and Jesse Bam Bam Rodriguez and certain guys like that. But Inoue, of course, has proved himself before, especially against Donaire, Steven Fulton, Lewis Neri, certain guys like that. So we'll see what ends up happening there. But I just kind of wanted to talk about that once again. Also in terms of the conversations of Inoue being quote-unquote overrated, because we all know that they're going to come, especially with the knockdown happening here. Well, Inoue's pound-for-pound ranking really doesn't change in my personal view. He still would be at number 3 in my personal view, but I need to see him at 126. And if he does lose to Nick Ball, then sure, we can derank him a little bit, maybe in terms of the pound-for-pound list, maybe put him down in the bottom 5 of the pound-for-pound. Although he clearly probably doesn't belong there in terms of weight or size, but, we'll have to see there because he is supposed to be in that conversation. If he is the number 1 pound-for-pound fighter, then he should be able to win that fight. So we'll have to see. But once again, this isn't enough to prove to me that Inoue is quote-unquote overrated because we've seen this with fighters time and time again. Does that mean that Crawford was just not pound for pound anymore because he had a shit performance over Aegis Kavaliauskas and lost a few rounds in that fight and probably got knocked down against Aegis Kavaliauskas? No, it doesn't mean that. It just means that Crawford's got to sharpen up on some things. Does that mean that Lomachenko, after the Jorge Linares fight, although Linares was definitely of higher caliber than either Aegis Kavaliauskas or this guy, Linares at the time was probably the best or the second best 135 pounder. Does that mean that Lomachenko after that fight was not pound for pound anymore because he got knocked down on that fight? Of course not. So once again, this is just, people are kind of overrating that a little bit, but people always go this crazy, especially when they're trying to prove that a fighter is quote unquote overrated. Inoue right now, I think is somewhat ranked where he belongs to be, at least on my list, at number 3. But in order to be higher, he is going to have to beat certain fighters that, in my view, are proven overall to be very tough or very challenging fights. MJ Akhmadaliev is good. That's a good start, but I just don't know if that's really going to rank him up on the pound-for-pound list. So it's going to be interesting. The fight that I'm going to be very interested to see is going to be either Junto Nakatani or that of a Nick Ball. Both of those fights are going to be very interesting. So we'll see. But that's pretty much all I got to say for now. In a way, I do think, just to talk a little bit more about the fight, I thought that, in certain moments he was very sharp, but he also did show some faults that he's got to tune up on. I think that he could work on his inside game a little bit. Keep both of your hands up at certain times, or at least keep one hand up when you're throwing certain punches. Keep that right hand glued to your face. Have a little bit more movement, with that of your head. I thought that he was doing a good job, but then when he got hit with that, that left hand to get knocked down, Inoue started going in a little bit more. But it was very clear that he was a little bit embarrassed by that, and he did the same thing with Neri. When he got knocked down against Neri, he started going on the inside, especially because he hears some of the criticisms of his inside game. He went on the inside, started countering, did a pretty good job, and ended up getting the knockout. But he's going to have to be careful, because against some of these guys like a Nick Ball, he can't afford to play overall, that of the, the ego game. He's going to have to really try to use his feet against that of a Nick Ball. Sometimes fight back against him, of course, but really try to outbox him and get him from there. So it's going to be very particularly interesting. But in a way, I thought, he overall did good, but of course he did show some of his faults, which can mainly be hubris and overconfidence, and tightening up on certain things that are the basics. Keep your right hand up when you're throwing that lead hand or throwing a hook. Make sure overall that you don't just come in with both of your hands down, willy-nilly. Just be very careful about that. Don't advertise your offense too much. Sometimes he does have a fault with that. So he's going to have to be very, very careful. But anyways, that pretty much is about it for today. Thank you all so much for watching. We'll see where Inoue goes next. Very excited to see him in his last 2 remaining fights of 2025. Should be very interesting. But anyways, that pretty much is about it for today. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll talk to you all later.